The invoice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under my front door like a threat in an envelope. $200. Itemized. One antique dining chair, damaged due to unsafe premises and owner negligence. She'd even typed up a little header with her name on it, Paige Clatch, in a font she probably thought looked professional. I stood in my hallway in my bathrobe, reading it 3 times. And then I did something I hadn't done in 11 months. I laughed. Not the polite kind, the real kind. The kind that comes up from somewhere low and takes a while to stop. I laughed until my eyes watered, and then I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and thought, honey, you have no idea what you just started. But let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the chair. And the chair doesn't make sense without Dennis. And Dennis doesn't make sense without 23 years of watching my only son slowly disappear. I moved into this house in 1987, the year my father died, and left it to me. It's not a grand house. 3 bedrooms, a front porch with a squeaky board on the left side that I have never fixed because I find it useful to know when someone is arriving. A kitchen with original tile that I refuse to replace because it's still perfectly good, and they don't make it that color anymore. A particular shade of sage green that I've always found calming, especially on winter mornings before the light is fully up. The hallway has the same floorboards as when my father moved in, which creak in their particular sequence. The 3rd board, then the 7th, then the one at the top of the stairs. And I know that sequence the way I know my own heartbeat. Gerald used to say I was sentimental about impractical things. He wasn't wrong. I just thought some impractical things were worth keeping. The furniture is old because I like old things. I was married once to a man named Gerald Crest, and when Gerald died of a cardiac event at 54, a Tuesday morning in October, without warning, the way those things usually happen, I kept everything exactly where it was for about 6 months. I kept his coffee mug on the 2nd shelf. I kept his reading chair by the window at its particular angle. And then one morning I woke up and understood that I was maintaining a museum, and that museums are for the dead, and I was still alive. And I rearranged the whole house in a single day because I needed it to feel like mine again. I moved Gerald's chair to the guest room and bought a new one I picked out myself. I rearranged the kitchen. I took down 2 photographs that had always hung where he put them and hung them where I wanted them instead. It was not a betrayal, it was housekeeping. The dining room chairs were not part of the rearrangement. They had always been mine. 8 of them, solid walnut, made by a craftsman named August Hoffner out of Cincinnati, who had a workshop on the east side and never advertised because he never needed to. My grandfather bought them in 1952, and they have sat around that table through every Christmas, every Easter, every family argument, every Sunday dinner, and one memorable Thanksgiving where my cousin Raymond got into the elderflower wine and tried to start a business meeting at the table, and another less memorable one where my Aunt Syl dropped an entire turkey on the floor and we ate sandwiches. They have held weight, they have held memory, they have been sat in by people who are no longer alive and people who are, and they have been present for the most important conversations of 3 generations of this family. They have never, not once in 70-some years, been unsafe. I am 68 years old. I was a certified public accountant for 31 years before I retired, the last 12 of them as a senior auditor at a regional firm that handled everything from restaurant chains to municipal pension funds. I am not a sentimental woman by nature. I am precise, I am methodical, I notice things. My colleagues used to joke that I could find a discrepancy in a grocery receipt at 20 paces, which was only slightly an exaggeration. I am telling you this because it matters, because the woman who sent me a $200 invoice for a chair she broke by sitting on it sideways had apparently forgotten, or never bothered to learn, exactly who she was dealing with. My son Dennis was 39 when all of this started. He has his father's height and my stubborn streak. which is a combination that has caused him more trouble than it should. He works in purchasing management for a regional distribution company, good at systems, at tracking, at making sure the pieces connect, but always better with things than with people, in the particular sense that things do not change their minds on him. He was married briefly in his early 30s to a woman named Elena, who was kind and a little lost and eventually moved to Seattle. They parted without drama. I had liked Elena, though I'd seen early that they didn't fit in the way that mattered. He married Paige 4 years ago. I remembered the first time he brought her to the house. She had walked through every room with the attentiveness of someone pricing things, which I had noticed and told myself I was being uncharitable about. She had complimented the house in the particular way that means the opposite. "So much character," she said, standing in my kitchen. And the word character in that sentence had the quality of a footnote explaining a polite fiction. Dennis had watched her with the slightly elevated attention of a man still trying to see himself through someone else's eyes. I had made dinner and watched them and said nothing, because saying something would have achieved exactly nothing and cost me everything. Dennis had always been attracted to certainty, to people who seemed to know exactly what they wanted and weren't apologetic about it. Paige was that kind of person. She wanted things with a particular intensity that could look, at first glance, like passion. It took me a while to understand that it wasn't passion, it was acquisition. She acquired Dennis the way she acquired the apartment they shared, with strategy dressed as taste, with deliberate choices framed as natural preference. She was not unintelligent, in fact, quite the opposite. That was, in some ways, the problem. She was 41, a marketing consultant who worked from home and spent a lot of time on Instagram posting photographs of interiors that didn't actually belong to her. Our house, my house, appeared in 3 of her posts before I noticed and asked her to stop. She had photographed the kitchen in a particular golden afternoon light and captioned it, "Old homes have the best bones," with a thoughtful emoji, which I might have found touching, except that she had followed it up 2 weeks later with a comment to a friend, visible on her public page, about how she and Dennis really needed to think about what to do with that property. She deleted it after 2 days. I had already screenshot it. I saved everything. Old habit. The dinner that started all of this happened in September, 6 weeks before the invoice arrived. Dennis and Paige came for Sunday dinner, which happened about once a month. Not as often as I would have liked, but I had made my peace with that. I had made pot roast, which was Dennis's favorite, and an apple cake that I had been making since before he was born. The table was set properly. The chairs were, as always, solid and sound. Paige sat down in the way she did everything, with a kind of theatrical settling in, a performance of arrival. She pulled the chair out too far, turned it at an angle, and sat with one leg crossed over the other, leaning sideways with her elbow on the armrest in a way that distributed her weight entirely wrong. I noticed it because I noticed things, and I thought briefly about saying something, and then I thought, she's a grown woman. She can sit in a chair. 3 bites into the pot roast, there was a crack. Not a catastrophic crack. No one fell. No one was hurt. The left rear leg of the chair had split at the joint, and the chair listed slightly to one side. Paige stood up with enormous drama, one hand pressed to her heart as though she had narrowly survived something. Dennis asked if she was okay. She said she wasn't sure. She thought she might have pulled something. She spent the rest of dinner on the couch and didn't eat the apple cake. I looked at the chair. The joint had split cleanly at a stress point that could only be reached by applying lateral pressure, the kind of pressure you'd get from sitting sideways with your weight on one armrest. The wood itself was fine. It had done exactly what wood does when you ask it to do something it wasn't designed to do. I said nothing. I served coffee. I washed the dishes after they left and put the chair in the garage to look at later. 6 weeks later, the invoice. I set it on the kitchen counter and called Ruth. Ruth Flint had been my closest friend for 22 years. We met at a continuing education seminar for CPAs in 1999, bonded immediately over our mutual contempt for a lecturer who kept saying, at the end of the day, approximately every 40 seconds, and had been friends ever since. She was a retired notary, 65 years old, sharp as a letter opener, and completely without patience for what she called decorative nonsense, which was her term for any behavior that existed primarily for effect. She lived 12 minutes away, drove a sensible gray sedan, and had an opinion on everything, delivered with the precision of someone who had spent decades making legally binding documents airtight. I read her the invoice over the phone. There was a pause. She itemized it. Line items and everything. Marlene, she sent you an invoice for a chair that she broke. For $200. Another pause. Longer this time. I'm going to need you to bring this to Nitwits on Thursday. I want to hold it. The Nitwits had been meeting for 9 years. It started with 4 of us, me, Ruth, Dottie Ward from across the street, and a woman named Carol Beaumont, who had since moved to Tucson to be near her grandchildren. Over the years, the group had grown to 6 regulars and 2 occasional members. We met every other Thursday at whoever's house was on rotation. We knitted things of varying quality and ambition. We drank wine. We talked. The name was Dottie's idea, a play on nitwits that she had found hilarious, and the rest of us had found only slightly less so, but it had stuck. We had been known on some occasions to solve problems together. We had also been known, on some occasions, to make them considerably worse, which we considered an acceptable risk. On Thursday, I brought the invoice. I also brought the apple cake, because I had made a second one that week, partly out of spite, and partly because I find baking calming when I'm angry. We were meeting at Dottie's house, a cheerful yellow colonial directly across the street from mine, with window boxes and a doorbell that played a brief Mozart excerpt and a living room so thoroughly decorated with photographs of her grandchildren that you felt you were being watched no matter where you sat. Dottie was 70 years old and had the energy of someone 20 years younger, the social network of a small-town mayor, and the deceptively mild manner of a person who has learned that people tell you more when they don't think you're paying attention. She had lived across the street from me for 15 years. She knew everything about everyone on this block, not through gossip, but through the simple mechanism of being outside in her garden at all hours and possessing the kind of face that invited confidence. Also present were Beverly Morse, 63, a retired high school principal who still carried herself like one, Sandra Pack, 66, a former pharmaceutical sales rep with excellent taste in wine and a gift for reading people, and Joan Ellery, 68, a retired postal worker who had once famously memorized the address and box number of everyone on her route and could still recite them a decade after retirement. Joan was our occasional member in the sense that she showed up when something interesting was happening and somehow always knew when that was. I read them the invoice. The reaction was everything I could have hoped for. $200, Beverly said, setting down her knitting needles with a particular precision that meant she was seriously displeased. For a chair that she broke. In your house, Sandra added. At your table, Joan said. Eating your pot roast. That you made, Ruth concluded. Dottie, who had been listening from her armchair with the focused stillness of a person cataloging information, looked up from her half-finished scarf and said simply, "She's been telling people things." We all looked at her. "What kind of things?" I said. It wasn't really a question. Dottie set down her knitting. "Mrs. Pellegrino, you know, the one with the hydrangeas on Birchwood, She mentioned to me last week that she'd run into Paige at the pharmacy. Paige apparently said something about being worried about you, that you'd been a little forgetful lately, that the house needed some attention. She paused. Mrs. Pellegrino thought she was being a caring daughter-in-law. I thought she was building something. The room was quiet for a moment. I could hear the click of Beverly's needles starting again, slow and deliberate. "How long?" I asked. Dottie thought about it. "At least since the summer. That's when I first noticed she was talking to people on the street. Very sympathetic, very concerned." Sandra poured more wine into her glass, which was my cue that she was settling in for analysis. "So, the invoice isn't about the chair." "No," I said, "it's not about the chair." "It's a record," Ruth said. "She's creating a record. Unsafe premises, negligent maintenance. The chair is evidence in a case she's building." I nodded. I had come to the same conclusion the morning the invoice arrived, standing in my bathrobe in the hallway. I had spent 6 weeks thinking about it, letting the thoughts settle, letting the picture clarify. An accountant's instinct. Don't react to the number in front of you. Find the line it came from. "So what are we going to do?" Beverly asked, in the tone of a woman who already had 3 ideas and was waiting to see if anyone else had better ones. "We're going to get the chair appraised," I said. Ruth looked at me, a slow smile. "August Hoffner," she said. "August Hoffner," I confirmed. "Oh, this is going to be good," Dottie said, and picked up her knitting again. We spent the next 40 minutes discussing what we would do, or rather, what we said we would do, which was a different thing. There is a particular pleasure in planning out loud with people who understand that the plan being spoken is not entirely the plan. Sandra suggested I send Paige a formal letter, citing emotional distress caused by the defective invoice. Joan proposed I counter with an invoice for the pot roast, itemized by ingredient, with a labor charge for the 6 hours of preparation. Beverly, with the mild face of a retired educator, suggested I send the chair to a museum as a donation, and then present Paige with a certificate, thanking her for her role in the preservation of regional folk crafts. We laughed until Sandra knocked over her wine glass, which fortunately was empty, and Dottie refilled it immediately as though that had been the plan all along. What I was actually going to do was simpler and considerably more thorough, but it was good to laugh first. It always helps to laugh first. I drove home at 10:30, crossing the street from Dottie's lit yellow windows to my darker front porch, and sat for a while at the kitchen table before I went to bed. The house was quiet. The sage green tiles reflected the overhead light in their soft, particular way. I looked at the 7 remaining chairs around the dining room table. The gap where the 8th had been was visible now, a small absence in the symmetry. And I thought about my grandfather's hands, which I could barely remember, and about the craftsmen in Cincinnati who had built things to last. The next morning, I called an appraiser. His name was Thomas Wiley, and he came recommended by an antiques dealer I had done some estate accounting for years ago, before I retired. He was meticulous, bespectacled, and had the quality of complete and focused stillness that I associated with people who genuinely loved their work. He came to the house on a Wednesday with a magnifying glass, a camera, and a small reference library he carried in a worn leather satchel that had the patina of something that had been used regularly for 30 years. I made coffee. He barely noticed. He was already standing in the dining room, lifting the first chair to look at its underside. I let him work. There is a specific pleasure in watching someone who is truly expert at something do their work. the way precision and care become indistinguishable from each other. He spent 40 minutes with the 7 intact chairs, moving between them methodically, occasionally murmuring something to himself, photographing joints and grain patterns with the patient thoroughness of a person for whom every detail is potentially significant. Then he went to the garage and spent another 15 with the broken 8th, examining the fracture with his magnifying glass, running his thumb along the split joint, taking photographs from 6 different angles. He came into the kitchen wiping his hands on a cloth and sat down across from me and said, "Mrs. Crest, are you aware of the provenance of these pieces?" I told him what I knew. August Hoffner, Cincinnati, 1952, purchased by my grandfather. He nodded slowly. August Hoffner was a significant regional craftsman. He produced under 200 complete sets in his career, and most of them have been absorbed into private collections or, unfortunately, dispersed. The sets broken up, chairs separated, the context lost. The documentation is sparse, but the construction is identifiable. There's a particular method of joining he used, visible here and here. He showed me photographs on his camera, pointing with his pen. The walnut is old growth, pre-war stock. The joinery is mortise and tenon with drawbore pinning, which was already an older technique when Hoffner used it. He was committed to traditional methods when everyone else was moving to machine production. And someone has cared for these. The finish is original and maintained. That matters considerably. He set the camera down. Each chair, intact and properly authenticated, would be valued at approximately $4,200 on the current market, possibly more, depending on provenance documentation. I held my coffee cup and looked at the 7 chairs through the doorway into the dining room, where they stood in their ordinary positions around the table I had eaten at my entire life. And the damaged one? Repairable. The joint is intact. It's a stress fracture, not structural failure. The wood itself was not compromised. A competent furniture restorer could have it right for perhaps $300. Once restored, it would retain its full value. The stress fracture, interestingly, tells you something about how the damage occurred. It's consistent with lateral pressure applied at an angle, not with the kind of vertical load the joint was designed for. He paused. It's not a failure of the chair. It's a failure of application. He looked at his notes. The set of 8, authenticated and complete, would be substantially more valuable as a set than as individual pieces, somewhere in the range of $40,000 to $50,000. After he left, I sat with my coffee for a long time. A failure of application. I thought about that phrase. I thought about Paige, seated sideways in her performance of Arrival, and about my grandfather, who had bought these chairs because he wanted things that were built to last, and about the particular irony of someone calling a thing unsafe because they had used it wrong. Then I remembered the tray on the dining room wall, the decorative plates, the ones Paige had knocked off the wall on the same evening, the one that had shattered on the floor, which she had stepped over without comment while Dennis was getting paper towels. I had swept it up after they left. I had a photograph of the tray, which I took annually for my household inventory. The set was Haviland Limoges, 1893, 8 plates. I had inherited them with the house, never thought much about them, kept them on the wall because they looked nice. I called Thomas Wiley back. I described the set and sent him 2 photographs. His response came the following morning. "Mrs. Crest, those are Haviland Limoges Faience Deluxe, late 19th century, with the gold leaf rim that was discontinued after 1895. If the remaining 7 are in good condition, each plate is worth $3,800. The complete set of 8 would have been around $32,000. The broken one," a pause. The broken one is a loss. I thanked him. I hung up. I put the phone down on the kitchen counter next to the invoice. $200. She wanted $200. I went to my filing cabinet. This will take a moment to explain, but it's important. I am an accountant. I have always kept records the way some people keep grudges, meticulously and indefinitely. When Dennis and I had established a joint account for household expenses during the period when he was between jobs and staying with me, this was 5 years ago, before Paige, the account had never been fully closed. Dennis still had access to it. I still had access to it. I had not looked at it in 2 years, which was my error, not his. I looked at it now. I printed 3 years of statements and sat down at the kitchen table with a highlighter and a pad of paper, which is how I do all serious thinking, and I went through every line. It took the better part of an afternoon. When I was done, I had a list of transfers, small ones, $40 here, $75 there, occasionally $150, going from the joint account to an account I didn't recognize. Transfers authorized under Dennis's access credentials, but on dates and times when Dennis was, I knew with reasonable certainty, at work. 47 transfers over 32 months. Total, $14,380. I set down my highlighter. My hands were entirely steady. This is what it means to be a retired auditor. After enough years of finding discrepancies, the finding of them no longer shocks you. The number resolves itself calmly on the page, and you simply note it, and you proceed. I poured myself a glass of water. I stood at the sink and looked out at the front yard where the maple was starting to turn, and I thought about Dennis. Not with anger, not yet. With something sadder and quieter. A kind of grief for the person my son had been before he started disappearing into his wife's version of him. He hadn't been happy in that marriage. I knew that in the way mothers know things that can't be articulated, a knowledge that lives in the spaces between what's said and what isn't. I didn't know if he had known about the transfers. I thought it was possible he hadn't. I also thought that the time for not knowing was over. I called an attorney that evening. Her name was Claire Hadley. She had been referred to me by Ruth, who knew everyone useful in a 60-mile radius, and she specialized in estate and property law with a secondary practice in financial recovery cases. We met in her office the next Thursday morning in a building downtown that smelled of old carpet and good coffee, and I laid out everything: the invoice, Thomas Wiley's appraisals, the account statements, the photograph record. Claire read through it with the flat, absorbing attention of a person who had seen many things and evaluated them without theater. "The broken plate is interesting," she said. "I thought so. She broke something worth nearly $4,000 and sent you an invoice for $200. She flipped a page. "Do you have documentation of when the plate was broken? Date? Context?" "I have a photograph of the intact tray from my annual household inventory dated October 8th. The dinner was October 14th. I have the broken plate in a bag in my closet." She looked at me over her reading glasses for a moment. "Mrs. Crest, you are going to make this very easy." She went through the account statements more slowly, making notes. "The transfers. Do you have reason to believe your son authorized them?" "I have reason to believe he did not, but I can't prove it without more information." "We'll get more information." She set the papers down and folded her hands. "Here is what I suggest. We respond to the invoice first, formally, through this office with the appraiser's valuation attached. We note that the chair, valued at $4,200, was damaged through improper use by a guest, and that the associated broken Limoges plate, valued at $3,800, represents an unaddressed liability of the person who sent the invoice. She paused. That gets her attention and establishes the legal tone. Simultaneously, I'll begin the process of recovering access to the joint account and preparing a formal demand for the transferred funds. That's the main case. What about the other thing? I asked. The cognitive concerns she's been raising. Claire's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. Tell me about that. I told her about Dottie's report, the pharmacy conversation, the building of a narrative, the doctor's appointment I'd had scheduled for November, a routine checkup, and the fact that Paige had apparently spoken to someone at the office. Claire wrote something down. I want you to keep that appointment. I want you to ask your physician directly whether anyone has contacted the office on your behalf. And I want you to document his response, whatever it is. I nodded. Mrs. Crest, how is your relationship with your son? I looked at the window. The carpet in this office had a particular pattern, beige and rust, repeating. And I had been tracking it with my eyes without meaning to, a habit from the kind of long meetings where you need to look at something neutral while you think. We are not, I said carefully, as close as we were. He defers to his wife in most things. I believe he does this because it's easier than not doing it, and because he has convinced himself that what she wants is what he wants, and he has been doing this for long enough that he may no longer be certain of the difference. Claire nodded. Do you want to preserve the relationship? I want to preserve my son. The relationship can be rebuilt from whatever is left. She wrote something else down. We shook hands. I drove home through the October morning, the leaves starting in earnest now, the light clean and cold. I drove home through the October morning, the leaves starting in earnest now, the light clean and cold. I called Ruth from the car. Well? She's sharp. I like her. I told you. What's the plan? First, we answer the invoice. Silence for a moment. Then, how much are we sending back? $3,800. A pause. Then Ruth, in the tone of someone savoring something, for the plate. For the plate. Marlene, I love you. I know. Does she know about the chair yet? She's about to. I heard Ruth put her hand over the receiver and say something I couldn't make out. And then she came back and said, I'm telling the nitwits, Dottie's going to lose her mind. She was right about that. That night, I didn't sleep well. Not from anxiety. The anxiety had resolved itself some weeks earlier into something quieter and more purposeful, but from the particular alertness that comes before a thing you've been preparing for. I lay in my bedroom, which was dark the way the house was dark in October, the neighborhood sounds settling into their nighttime register, and I went through it all again. Not obsessively, methodically, the way I had reviewed audit files before a difficult presentation, not looking for problems, but confirming that I knew where everything was. I got up at 2 a.m. and made chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table. The sage green tiles were a neutral, muted color at that hour, more gray than green, which I found calming in its own way. I laid out the folder on the table, not to review it again, just to have it in front of me, the way some people keep a photograph or a letter before a hard conversation. The invoice was on top. I looked at it. $200. Itemized. Owner negligence. I thought about my grandfather, who I had met only a handful of times before he died when I was 9, but who I remembered with the specific clarity that childhood memories sometimes have. a large, careful man with big hands who smelled of pipe tobacco and wood shavings, who had driven me to the hardware store once and let me choose the screws for a birdhouse project, and who had considered my choice with the same serious attention he would have given an adult. He had bought these chairs the year I was born. He had brought them home in his truck and placed them around the table, and they had been in this family for as long as I had been in it. They had held everyone I had ever loved at dinner. No one was going to put that in a legal brief and use it to call me incompetent, not while I could still read a bank statement. I drank my tea, I washed the cup, I went back to bed and lay there until the light started at the edge of the curtains, and then I got up and made coffee and prepared for the day. I felt, for the first time in months, something that I could only call ready. Not excited, not righteous. Ready in the plain, workmanlike sense of someone who has assembled all the pieces and confirmed they fit. The letter from Claire Hadley's office arrived at Paige and Dennis's house on a Monday morning, which I knew because Dennis called me Monday afternoon. He did not sound like himself. He sounded like a man who had just read something that required him to reorganize several things he thought he understood. "Mom, what is this?" "It's a formal response to the invoice your wife sent me. She's got a claim in here for nearly $4,000. For the Limoges plate that was broken at the dinner in October? Yes." A pause. "The plate that Paige knocked off the wall when she stood up from the table to go to the couch. I have photographs." Longer pause. I could hear him breathing. "Mom, this is..." "Dennis." I kept my voice level. I had practiced this. Not the words exactly, but the tone. The particular steadiness that means I am not angry, I am not wounded, I am simply telling you the truth. Your wife sent me a legal document demanding money for property damage in my home. I responded through an attorney. That is a reasonable and proportionate response. I think she was just frustrated. It was an impulsive thing. It was an itemized invoice on company letterhead. He went quiet. "I want to talk to you, Dennis. Not about the letter. About some other things. Can you come over Thursday evening?" Another pause. I could almost feel him calculating what Paige would think, what it meant that he was being asked alone, whether he could find an acceptable story for it. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'll come Thursday." I made pot roast again. This seemed right. The house was warm and it smelled like it was supposed to, like the Sundays he had grown up with. The particular combination of braised meat and rosemary and the underlying smell of old wood and familiar rooms that I have never been able to describe to anyone who didn't already know it. I had also made the apple cake, which I had not planned to make, and then found myself making anyway, the way you sometimes find yourself doing things your hands knew before your mind decided. When Dennis came in through the front door, I noticed that he looked tired in a way that had settled into the lines around his eyes, the specific exhaustion of a man who has been managing something difficult for long enough that he's stopped noticing the effort. His coat was the one I had given him 2 Christmases ago, navy wool, and it had been taken care of. He had always taken care of his things, but it hung on him slightly differently than it used to, as though he had lost a little weight, or simply a little of the ease he used to carry. He stood in the hallway and looked at the house the way you look at a place that has been the same for your entire life, not noticing it exactly, but registering it somewhere below notice, in the part of the brain that keeps track of what is stable. "Hi, Mom." "Come in. It's cold." He sat down at the table. 7 chairs now. The 8th was in the garage, waiting for the restorer. He noticed the gap. He looked at it for a moment without saying anything, and I saw him understand it. Not the legal situation, not the invoice, but simply the absence of the chair at the table where it had always been. The visible fact of something that had been broken and not yet mended. I served dinner. We ate. We talked about ordinary things, his job, my garden, a tree on the north side of the house that needed trimming before winter. He was good at ordinary conversation, always had been. His father had been the same way, that particular skill of filling silence with warmth while keeping the harder things at a distance. I had lived with that skill for 22 years. I knew how to move past it when I needed to. There was a moment about halfway through the apple cake when Dennis looked up at me with an expression I recognized from when he was very young, maybe 8 or 9. The expression he wore when he had done something he knew was wrong and hadn't yet decided whether to confess to it or hope it wouldn't come up. He had always been a terrible liar, not because he lacked the instinct for it, but because his face had never gotten the memo. After dinner, I poured coffee and I brought the folder to the table. I didn't say anything. I just set it down between us and let him open it. He went through it slowly. I watched his face. He had Gerald's face in repose, a particular quality of stillness when thinking, the slight tightening around the jaw. He turned the pages. He stopped at the account statements. He looked at the highlighted transfers. He turned the page, read the total, and then he set the folder down and sat back and looked at the ceiling. "When did you find this?" "3 weeks ago." "Why didn't you—" He stopped, reconsidered, started again. "Did you know I was going to come to you? I was going to—" He pressed his hands flat on the table, a gesture I recognized, something he did when he was trying to keep himself contained. "She told me it was for things we needed, that you'd offered, that the account was—" "I never offered anything, Dennis." He didn't answer. His jaw worked. "Did you know?" He looked at me then, and what I saw in his face was not guilt exactly. It was the particular look of a person who has suspected something and told themselves not to look too closely, and is now confronted with the cost of not looking. "Not the amount," he said. "I knew I thought it was smaller. I thought it was—" He shook his head. "I should have looked." "Yes." We sat with that for a moment. "There's more," Dennis said. It wasn't a question. "There's a doctor's appointment next week. I want you to know that I am entirely well, and I want you to know that if anyone has suggested otherwise to my physician, that suggestion has been professionally documented and is now part of a legal file." The color in his face changed in a way that told me everything. "Dennis, listen to me carefully. I am not angry at you, but I need you to understand what has been happening." I leaned forward. "There is a case being built, a narrative, an incompetent mother, a house that needs attention, a concerned son with legitimate reasons to seek protective oversight of her affairs. The invoice wasn't about the chair. It was the first entry in a record." He looked down at the folder. Then he closed his eyes. "The attorney she recommended," he said. I waited. 2 months ago. She found an attorney who specializes in— She said it was standard planning, that it was responsible. I had 1 consultation. He opened his eyes. "I didn't sign anything. I stopped. I couldn't." He looked at me, and for a moment he looked exactly like the boy he had been at 10, when he had broken a neighbor's window with a baseball and come home to confess before the neighbor could call. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I looked at my son. I thought about all the years, the ordinary, unremarkable years of raising him, the specific texture of who he had been before he learned to defer to someone else's version of him. The chair at the table, the pot roast, the apple cake. "I know you are," I said. "Now let's figure out what we're going to do." He stayed until 11. When he left, the folder went with him. The following Tuesday, I had my appointment with Dr. Anand, who had been my physician for 9 years and was a careful, unhurried man who asked complete sentences and listened to the answers. I asked, toward the end of the appointment, whether anyone had contacted his office on my behalf in recent months. There was a brief pause. He looked at his notes. "There was a phone call in August," he said carefully, "from someone identifying herself as your daughter-in-law. She expressed concern about cognitive changes she had observed. She asked that we add a cognitive evaluation protocol to your scheduled appointments. I nodded. And did you? I added a note to request your consent at your appointment, which I was going to do today. He looked at me. I was going to ask whether you were experiencing any difficulties and whether you'd like a screening. That's standard when a family member raises concerns. I understand. Do you have concerns based on our interactions? He reviewed his notes with the unhurried thoroughness that I had always appreciated in him. No, I do not. Would you be willing to document that? He looked at me for a moment. Yes, Mrs. Crest, I would. I drove home in the November morning feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Solid. The way ground feels after you've been walking on ice for a while. That first step onto something that doesn't shift. I called Claire. I called Ruth. I called Dottie, who had been watching from across the street. She had seen Dennis's car Thursday evening, had noted the length of the visit, had been trying not to ask questions and failing. How did it go? He came around. Completely? Enough. He's hurt and he's embarrassed, but he's there. What about her? She doesn't know yet that Dennis has the folder. Silence. Then, when does she find out? Claire is filing the demand letter this week, the recovery claim for the transferred funds, $14,380, plus the cost of the appraisal and legal fees. The silence on Dottie's end had a particular quality, the silence of a woman across the street who could see my front door from her living room window. She's going to come to you. I know. Do you want me to come over? Not yet, but keep your phone on. Paige came on a Friday afternoon, which I hadn't expected. I had thought it would be the weekend. She knocked rather than ringing the bell, which was already different from her usual manner. I watched her from the kitchen window for a moment before I went to the door. She was standing on the porch with her arms crossed, wearing a coat I recognized as expensive, looking at the floorboards with the fixed expression of someone composing themselves. I opened the door. She was different. The particular polished confidence she usually wore, that studied ease, was still there on the surface, but it was working harder than usual. I could see the effort. Marlene, can we talk? I stepped back and let her in. I did not offer coffee. I sat in the armchair by the window, the one I had rearranged from Gerald's spot years ago and made mine, and I folded my hands and waited. Paige sat on the couch. She looked around the room, at the pictures, the furniture, the remaining 7 plates on the dining room wall with their conspicuous gap. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I said nothing. The invoice. I should have talked to you first. I know that. I was frustrated after the dinner. It was an impulsive thing. I absolutely didn't mean for it to become... I never imagined you'd take it to an attorney. It was a legal document, I said. It was $200, Marlene. It wasn't... It was sent on letterhead, itemized, with a claim of premises negligence. Those are legal terms. I kept my voice entirely even. I responded appropriately. Her jaw tightened. The mask shifted slightly. The money. The account transfers. Dennis said you found... He says there's a claim for $14,000. She shook her head. That account was a household account. Dennis and I used it for household expenses. Things for the house. Things we needed. It was a joint account between Dennis and me, I said. Your name is not on it. The transfers were authorized under Dennis's credentials to an account held solely in your name. That is the definition of misappropriation of funds, which is what the demand letter says. The silence that followed had weight to it. "You're going to destroy this family," she said. I looked at her. I looked at her for a long time, the way I had learned to look at numbers that were trying to tell me something other than what they meant. "Paige," my voice was quiet and entirely steady, the voice I used when I needed something to land completely. "You sent me an invoice for a chair. You broke a plate worth nearly $4,000 and said nothing. You told people in this neighborhood and this community that I was losing my mind. You contacted my physician. You recommended an attorney to my son for a guardianship consultation." I paused. "You built a very careful structure. The problem with careful structures is that they can be read once you know what you're looking at." Her hands had tightened in her lap. "I was trying to help." "I know what you were trying to do." I stood up, not in anger. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I stood up because I was finished with the conversation and I wanted to be standing when I ended it. The demand letter asks for the return of $14,380 within 30 days. If it's returned, the matter is resolved privately. If it isn't, Claire Hadley will file suit, and the details of the account activity will become part of the public record. I walked to the door. "You're absolutely right, by the way. Families should be honest with each other." So I was. I opened the door. She stood. She looked at me, and I could see in her face the rapid recalculation, the reassessment of what she was dealing with, who she had assumed I was versus who I turned out to be. Dennis has the folder," I said. "He's known for 2 weeks. Whatever conversation you need to have with him, you need to have with him." She walked past me. I closed the door behind her. I stood in my front hall and listened to her car start and pull away. And then I was standing alone in my house with the sage green kitchen tiles and the 7 remaining plates on the wall and the table with its 7 chairs, and it was very quiet. I called Ruth. "Well?" She came. And she left. A long beat. Then, "Marlene, tell me everything. Do not leave anything out." I told her everything. The following Thursday, the Nitwits met at my house. Joan came, which told me that word had traveled through whatever channel Joan used for intelligence. Sandra brought wine that was considerably nicer than our usual, which was her way of signaling that an occasion warranted it. Beverly brought a cheese plate. Dottie came across the street with her knitting bag and a particular expression of satisfied anticipation that I found deeply comforting. We sat in the living room with the fire going. November had finally committed to itself, and I told them all of it from the beginning. The invoice, Thomas Wiley, the transfers, the doctor's appointment, the conversation with Dennis, the conversation with Paige. I told it straight, without editorial commentary, the way you deliver a report. They were excellent listeners. When I finished, there was a brief, companionable silence, the kind that good friends observe when something is complete and needs a moment before it's discussed. Then Joan said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" I asked. "The chair. I keep thinking about the chair. Can we do something good with the chair?" This opened a discussion that lasted approximately 40 minutes and involved several proposals that will not be repeated here. Beverly suggested having it restored and presented to Dennis and Paige as a wedding anniversary gift with an appraiser's certificate attached, which we all agreed was elegant, but perhaps too much. Sandra proposed mounting the split leg in a shadow box and hanging it in the hallway as art. Joan suggested having it fully restored, then contracting with a local museum that had a craftsman exhibition and donating it, with a placard noting the provenance and the near loss, which she said would count as a charitable deduction. It was Ruth who had the final idea, and it was the right one. Restore it. Put it back at the table. Don't say anything about it to anyone. Let it be there. We all thought about that. Yes, I said. That's it. The chair went to a furniture restorer named Marcus Webb in the next town over, who had been recommended by Thomas Wiley. He was a quiet, concentrated man who looked at the damaged joint with the care I associated with people who respected what they were working on. He had it back to me in 3 weeks, the split repaired, the wood cleaned and lightly refinished, the joint stronger than before. He charged me $280. I wrote the check without any irony because Marcus Webb had earned it. The chair went back to the table. 8 chairs again, the symmetry restored. Dennis called me in December. He called himself, which was something he hadn't done much in the past 2 years. His calls had usually been from Paige's phone or arranged by her or shaped by whatever version of the conversation she preferred. This was his phone, his voice, his initiative. Mom, I want to come for Christmas. You're always welcome, Dennis. Paige won't be coming. I waited. He paused. We're working some things out. There are some conversations we haven't had yet. Another pause. I'm sorry. For the consultation and for the account and for not. His voice caught briefly, the way it had caught when he was a boy, and working up to something that cost him. For not looking. I know, Dennis. Can I still come? Of course you can come. I looked at the kitchen, at the sage green tiles, at the table in the dining room with its 8 chairs. I'm making pot roast, a quiet exhale, something loosening. Apple cake? Apple cake. He came on Christmas Eve and stayed through the 26th. We played cards in the evenings. We watched old movies he'd liked as a child. He slept in his old room, which still had the same quilt his grandmother had made. And on Christmas morning, he sat at the dining room table with his coffee and looked at the 8 chairs with the particular look of a person noticing something he'd assumed was lost. You fixed it. Had it fixed. Marcus Webb, very good restorer. He ran his hand along the back of the repaired chair. The joint was seamless now, tighter than the others. It looks good. It does. He sat down in it, carefully, properly, and drank his coffee. I refilled mine and sat across from him and looked at my son, who was tired and bruised and working through something hard, but who was here, at this table, in this house, on this morning. What happened afterward came in stages, which is how legal things usually go. The demand was not met in 30 days. Claire Hadley filed suit in January. The discovery process, as these things do, revealed more than the transfers. Credit card accounts opened in Dennis's name without his full knowledge. A refinancing inquiry on their mortgage that Dennis had not authorized. By March, it was not one case, but several, and Paige had retained her own attorney, and the particular careful edifice she had built over 4 years was being examined with the unhurried attention it deserved. I thought during those months about the early days of their marriage, the first Thanksgiving, the first Christmas. I had been hopeful then in the careful, qualified way that I am hopeful about things I don't entirely trust. I had made an effort. I had included Paige in conversations, asked her about her work, tried to find the common ground that exists somewhere between any 2 people who care about the same person. She had been warm those first months, interested. She had asked about my career, my father, the history of the house. I had found this touching. I had let myself be touched by it. It was only later that I understood what she had been doing. She had been gathering information. She was thorough, I'll give her that. She had conducted the kind of due diligence on this family that I used to conduct on audit clients, and she had done it with the smile of someone paying a genuine compliment. Every story about the house, about the furniture, about what had been left to whom and why, she had filed it away. She was building a map. I had thought she was building a relationship. That was the mistake I was most honest with myself about in the kitchen at 2 a.m. with my tea. Not that I had liked her, not even that I had trusted her, but that I had been deceived by effort, which should have told me something, because real warmth doesn't feel like effort. Real warmth has a different texture. I had known that for a long time and set it aside because I wanted Dennis to be happy, and I had let my wanting cloud my noticing. A rare failure. I was allowed to be human about it. Dennis moved out of the house he and Paige had shared in February. He rented an apartment 20 minutes from me, which he described as small and sensible, neither of which bothered him the way they might have once. He came for dinner on Sunday evenings when he could. He called me himself. I went to the doctor in April for my regular checkup. Dr. Anand and I had a brief, pleasant conversation about my blood pressure, which was fine, and my cholesterol, which was also fine, and my general state, which he characterized as excellent. "Any concerns?" he asked. "None," I said. He made a note in the file and smiled. The money was recovered in the settlement, not the full amount, but enough, and the method of recovery was satisfying in the particular way that precise things are satisfying. The guardianship consultation was documented and entered into the record and then became irrelevant, because you cannot pursue a guardianship case against a woman who is demonstrably well, carefully documented, professionally represented, and has just spent 6 months navigating a financial fraud case with the methodical precision of someone who has been doing exactly that kind of work her entire life. Paige lost, among other things, access to 2 accounts she had considered secure, the social standing of the concerned and devoted daughter-in-law, and the narrative she had been building for 3 years, on the premise that I didn't notice things. I noticed things. In May, the Nitwits met at Sandra's house, which had a back porch that caught the afternoon sun and was, Sandra insisted, the correct place to be in spring. We had been making a joint project all winter, a blanket for a local shelter, which we had been working on since December in various shades of blue and green that had required several arguments about color theory before we arrived at a palette that satisfied everyone. Joan had finished the final seam 2 weeks earlier, and Sandra had had it washed and pressed, and it looked, honestly, quite good. "We should do another," Beverly said. "We're going to do a quilt next year," Dottie said. "I've already looked at patterns." "Of course you have," Ruth said. We sat in the afternoon sun and worked on our individual projects and passed the wine and talked about ordinary things, which is to say, the things that actually make up a life. Dottie's granddaughter's school play, Sandra's upcoming trip to see her sister in Portland, Joan's strong opinion about a new restaurant downtown that she felt had been overpraised. The afternoon was warm and unhurried, the light coming through Sandra's maple trees at the angle that made everything look good, and I sat with my coffee. I had switched to coffee at the evening meetings, which Ruth had observed and wisely not commented on. And I thought about nothing in particular for a while, which is a thing I had not been able to do for many months. Ruth leaned over and looked at the scarf I was working on. "Is that ever going to be long enough?" "It's long enough," I said. "It just needs blocking." "For what? A medium-sized giraffe?" "It's for Dennis." She looked at me. Her face did the thing it did when she was fond of something and didn't want to make it a production. "Good," she said, and went back to her knitting. The summer was quiet. Dennis settled into his apartment and seemed, gradually, to sleep better. He found a therapist he didn't hate, which took some effort. He started cooking for himself, which he had not done in years, and occasionally sent me photographs of the results, some of which were better than others. We talked on the phone twice a week, which was more than we had in the past 4 years, and the conversations were different, shorter in some ways, more direct, less careful. In August, I had the maple tree trimmed, the north one, the one Dennis and I had noticed at Christmas needed attention. The tree service sent a young man named Calvin who worked carefully and knew what he was doing. And when he was finished, the tree looked balanced and clean, the dead growth cleared away, the healthy branches given room. He admired the front porch while I was writing his check, said old houses had good bones, and meant it as the true thing, not the polite fiction. "Character," I said. He looked at me, not sure if I was agreeing or not. "The house has character," I said. "You're right." He nodded, tucked the check in his pocket, and drove away. I stood on the porch and watched him go, and then I stood there a while longer. The neighborhood was doing its August thing, lawn mowers in the distance, a dog somewhere to the east, the particular quality of afternoon air that smells of cut grass and warm pavement, and something sweet from whoever's garden is at peak bloom this week. Dottie was deadheading her roses across the street, which she did with the focused attention of a surgeon. She looked up and waved. I waved back. A week later, Dottie called to tell me that Paige had put her and Dennis's house on the market. It had been listed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, there were 2 offers. Dottie had checked the listing, which included photographs of every room, and had called me specifically to tell me that none of the photographs showed the interior of the house from angles that would reveal how little Paige had actually furnished it. Real estate photography, she noted, was its own kind of fiction. "She's good at presentation," I said. "She is," Dottie agreed. "She always has been." We talked for a while about other things. Dottie's granddaughter was starting kindergarten in September, and Dottie was making her a sweater, which she had started at the last Nitwits meeting and was already halfway done. I told her about Dennis's apartment, about the cooking photographs, about the Sunday dinners. She listened in the good way, without filling in the spaces. "He's going to be all right," she said. "He is," I agreed. "He just needed to stop being managed." A pause. Then Dottie, with the mild, accurate precision of someone who has watched human nature from a front porch for a very long time. "They all do eventually." I went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the sage green tiles. The table in the dining room with its 8 chairs, solid and even. The repaired one indistinguishable from the rest after Marcus Webb's careful work. The 7 plates on the wall, and the space where the 8th had been, I had not replaced it, had decided against replacing it, had left the gap as a small, clean fact about what had happened here and what it had cost. But the house was still standing, the table was still there, the chairs were still there, all 8 of them, including the one that had been broken and brought back. I thought about the invoice again, not with anger, not anymore, with something closer to the dispassionate clarity I had felt reading it the first time, before I laughed. It had been sent to tell me something, just not what Paige thought she was saying. She had meant it as the opening line of a story about my incompetence, my negligence, my gradual retreat from the ability to manage my own affairs. What it turned out to be was the first line of a different story, about what happens when someone who has spent 31 years reading numbers attempts to use a legal document against a woman who spent 31 years finding discrepancies. The chair was back at the table. The family was not what it had been, but families rarely are. Dennis was 20 minutes away, cooking his own food, calling his own mother, building something back up from what was left. That was more than enough. That was, in fact, everything that mattered. I drank my coffee. It was exactly as good as I made it, which was how I had always made it, which was how I had always known how to do it. And no $200 invoice sent on letterhead in the month of October was ever going to change that. I finished the coffee. I rinsed the cup. I went out to the garden while the light was still right, and I worked for an hour in the dirt, and it was exactly enough.